Now, there are a lot of interesting comments on this. Jewish people actually see it as being significant. Because of its coming together of various elements with current events and trends in the Middle East, some Jewish and Christian scholars are suggesting we're on the way to the fulfillment of this prophecy. Now, there are a number of different interpretations of it. Some liberal scholars would say it's just a symbolic picture of the battle of good and evil, which should not be taken literally. I once discussed this with not a semi-orthodox rabbi. He told me that it was about wars in the Persian Empire in the Bible times which have long passed, therefore does not have a future reference. I asked him which battles, and he didn't really answer. Same time, the general Orthodox view is that it is a prophecy relating to an apocalyptic war at the dawn of the Messianic age. There's a man in Israel called Rabbi Pinchas Wilson. He's a very prolific writer. He's written over 100 books on the subject, and he identifies Ezekiel 38 and 39 and Zechariah 12 to 14 as pre-Messianic wars over Israel. Takes a pretty similar line to us, except doesn't believe the Messiah is Yeshua. According to the Orthodox Chabad website, that's Lubavitch, they say that the prophet Ezekiel, chapters 38 to 39, describes a climatic battle that will be instigated by Gog and or Magog and be waged against Israel and God. And there's a rabbi in Jerusalem called Yekutiel Fish, prominent Jewish mystic, who stated unequivocally that the current war in Ukraine is a precursor to the pre-Messiah war of Gog and Magog. Rabbi cited the Midrash in Bereshit Rabbah, which states, if you see kingdoms taunting each other, you can anticipate the footsteps of the Messiah. And he speaks about the armies which fight each other and then stop fighting each other and start fighting Israel. Says they will not succeed. This will, of course, be due to God intervening to prevent them from harming Israel. But you can see that there are Jewish people who are writing about this and saying that we're on the way to this being fulfilled. And of course, there are Christians who are writing about it as well. A lot of different views on this subject. Perhaps the major ones, one expressed by Arnold Fruchtenbaum in his book, The Footsteps of the Messiah. He says this event will happen before the event known as the rapture of the church. So the rapture of the church will happen first. Then the tribulation will come, but this battle will come before the rapture and therefore before the tribulation. In other words, it could happen any time now. It will set off the events which will lead to the 7-year period at the end of the age and the day of the Lord. I get a magazine from Australia called Herald of Hope. They say that this event will happen in the first half of the tribulation period, in other words, after the rapture, when Russian and Islamic forces invade the land of Israel. So you've got two options there, before or after the rapture. And finally, there's a man called Joel Richardson who wrote a book called The Islamic Antichrist. He believes actually the rapture comes at the end of the tribulation, and he puts Ezekiel 38 and 39 as the same event as Armageddon. So in his view, this happens at the end of the tribulation, is followed immediately by the return of the Lord to the earth and setting up of his messianic kingdom, Zechariah 14 and Revelation 16. Joel actually says this is an Islamic invasion, not led by Russia, but by Muslim powers hostile to Israel. In his interpretation, Gog, the leader of this alliance, is the same person as the Islamic Mahdi, who, according to Muslim belief, will bring about the end of days battle and the worldwide victory of Islam. The Mahdi's objective in the war will be to restore full Islamic control of Jerusalem and end Israel, in particular of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the end Jewish control of Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock, which of course stand where the Temple Mount, on the Temple Mount. In Joel's view, actually, the Ezekiel's Gog is the same person as the beast or the Antichrist. He says he's a Muslim leader who comes probably out of Turkey. As we question some things about Israel, about Russia, this does raise itself as a possibility. I still think it is Russia, for reasons I'll tell you in a moment. But one thing we have to say is that since this event hasn't yet happened, we do have to be open to different possibilities of how it might happen. I'm telling you some of this. Okay, so let's go back and have a look at the current situation and see how it fits in, and then we'll conclude with a word about the coming of the Lord. Now, one of the issues, I said, relating to Russia, Iran and Syria and China, is the fact that Russia today has been weakened by the Ukraine war. And it's one of the questions I've sort of wrestled with. I haven't really come to an answer yet, but the issue of Ukraine does raise questions about how prepared or able Russia would be to launch invasion, bringing its troops into another part of the world. Ukraine war has actually turned into a disaster for Russia, with its army weakened, its morale and weaponry destroyed, its economy in trouble, and US estimates around 200,000 Russian casualties in Ukraine, killed or seriously wounded. Up to 1 million men have fled Russia to avoid being called up into the army, and the Russian army has been humiliated and exposed as badly equipped and guilty of war crimes against civilians. Nevertheless, I read, is it yesterday's Telegraph? Said defeated Russia is still a threat to Britain. But he says here, it's very easy to look and think that the Russian military has collapsed and is in dire trouble, but it's uneven, said General Cavoli at a security conference in Tallinn in Estonia. And the ground forces are greatly eroded, he said. They've run into big trouble, but the Navy has lost almost nothing. Cyber has lost nothing. Space has lost nothing. How long would it take Russia to rebuild? Question is, how long would it take them to rebuild to do what? They're capable of doing things today. Now, there's all sorts of contradictory things being said about the state of Russia at the present time. But if it's right that Russia could rebuild, if it comes out of Ukraine, use its navy, its air force, and also use cyber, try to disable Israel's technology, it's possible that Russia could be the leading force in this coming army. You've also got Russia and Iran. One of the things which we're noticing is the deepening relationship between Russia and Iran. It's happening. There's Putin going to talk to the Ayatollahs in Iran. The Iranian regime itself is also in trouble, of course. It's got many people today rejecting the Islamic rulers, crying out to freedom from the imposition of Islamic tyranny. We saw at the end of the last year a rebellion against them, led largely by young people who are fed up with being told what to do by Islamists, whose main achievement since 1979 Islamic Revolution has been to make Islam hated and feared by the majority. And of course, many young people actually want a secular Western-style government and are open to Christianity and the gospel. Presently, the Iranian regime seems to have contained the revolution, which erupted in 2022. It's only done this by suppressing the people, by imprisoning members of the opposition, thus making itself even more unpopular. What we're noticing, though, is that Russia and China are becoming more involved in Iran, and both have a strong interest in keeping the present regime in power. China's been giving them some cameras to put in Tehran and all around the place to pick out any troublemakers, pick out any women who are not wearing the hijab, and finding them on the spot so that they are basically controlling the people with the kind of mechanism which China is also using to control its population. China's getting involved in these places. Now, if the Islamic regime should fall or Russia should be defeated in Ukraine, it would actually make it quite difficult for this lineup to happen. But all things are possible. Now, one thing which you notice with Ezekiel is it implies that the leader of this alliance is going to send a lot of troops to fight in this battle. Another interesting little fact here about Russia and Syria. There's Mr. Assad, the president of Syria, with Putin. Russia came into Syria to keep Assad in power during the civil war. Got a long-term alliance. Russia needs to keep Assad in power because Russia has two warm water ports which it uses in Syria, one at a place called Latakia, one at a place called Tartus on the Syrian coast. It also has an air base at a place called Hymenium, and it's a very important strategic ally for Russia. Now, if you know your geography, Syria is just above Israel. So having Russia on the borders of Israel is interesting, to put it mildly. Russia was used to keep Assad in power. One of the ways they did it was to bomb the opposition into submission, particularly the city of Aleppo, the second city in Syria, which they basically reduced to rubble, as they've done in parts of Ukraine. Russia's tactic for winning wars is to bomb the places. Nevertheless, Assad has asked for more Russian soldiers to come into Syria. There's a Russian soldier, there's a bombed-out city in Syria. He asked Russia to maintain permanent bases in Syria. Russia's already supplying Syria with anti-aircraft missiles, SS-400s, by which it can control the airspace above Syria. Israel needs to get into the Syrian airspace to hit Iranian targets they want to hit there. It's recently hit targets in Damascus, which has not pleased either Assad or Putin. And you have this situation in Syria which is building up, which could bring Russia involved. Also, you have in Syria now Iranian and Turkish forces. So you've got Russia, Iran, and Turkey already in Syria, just to the north of Israel. You've also got China taking a part in the situation. That's China making a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's just happened. Is that interesting? Is it significant? One of the things you're noticing is that China is taking a growing interest in the Middle East and a growing power in the world. China actually sees itself as a partner now with Russia, and Russia and China have their plan for a Russian-Chinese New World Order, which has other countries, including Iran and other nasty countries, involved in trying to make their New World Order. In fact, in this agreement, China is becoming the dominant partner, not Russia. And especially since the Ukraine war, Russia is losing power, China is gaining power. China is pushing for a peace settlement in Ukraine, proposing that I think the ideal is that Russia retains control of Crimea and the Donbass area while committing not to take any more territory in Ukraine. Ukraine is then defended by NATO from any further aggression from Russia. Now, that is not happening at the moment, but Russia is actually basically subject to China in this situation. It's interesting. And Russia's weakness is making it more dependent on China. One of the things which this is a bit away from the Middle East, but as Russia has been expending 20,000 troops to get a town in Ukraine called Bakhmut, which they say is of no strategic value, it's losing control over a vast area of Asia. The Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all those countries recently had a summit with China, which means that China is taking more and more interest and control over them. The far east of Russia, go to the end of the Trans-Siberian Railway, you get to a place called Vladivostok, which used to be a Chinese city, and now China is getting back into that and saying they want more interest, they're getting control of the port city, and you can see that China is actually making inroads into Russia's far east. So another interesting thing, but China is a dominant power. China is moving into all parts of the world, including the Middle East. And they made this deal with Iran and Saudi Arabia. Very big deal. Saudi and Iran have been at loggerheads, fighting Saudi, the leading Sunni power, Iran, the leading Shiite power, hostile to each other. Iran's actually hit Saudi with missiles, possibility of even conflict coming between those two countries. Now they've made an agreement, diplomatic relations again, and they're now beholden to China. Saudi is becoming more beholden to China as well. They're pushing to change the petrodollar system so that America will be pushed out and China will have growing control in that part of the world. Interestingly, China is also making proposals for an Israel-Palestine peace agreement. And China has an interest in Israel. It's got a lot of investment in Israel, remarkably. A few weeks ago, Barbara and I were in Tel Aviv. We were stuck in a traffic jam where they're making a new transit system. And we asked the taxi driver what was going on. He said, well, they're making this transit system. He told us that the people who are doing the work on it are Chinese immigrant workers. They've got thousands of Chinese immigrant workers in Israel building up the infrastructure. Is that a good idea? Probably not. But China's involved in the Middle East, and it wants to be more involved. China, of course, is building up its army, threatening Taiwan, making a big investment in it, and has an eye on the Middle East. Is China part of the kings of the East of Revelation chapter 16? I think so. So watch China. They're already involved. China also held naval drills in the last few months in the Middle East, in the Gulf of Oman, with Russia, China, and Iran coming together as a unit to assert some kind of a power and to confront the United States and their power in a region which America sees as very significant to them. So you have Russia, China, Iran moving into that area.